rejected 9 times for her red hair, until a widowed lumberjack braided it himself. The axe came down and the round split clean, and I didn't even look up. I knew by the creak of the gate who it was. Harlan Metz, coming the same way he always came, slow, like his own weight was a burden he'd rather set down somewhere and leave. He crossed the yard in that rolling walk of his, stopped about 10 feet off, and I kept splitting. There were 3 more cords needed before first snow, and I wasn't going to get them by listening to Harlan Metz stand in my yard and breathe. "Riordan," he said. I set the next round on the block. "What?" "You hear about the Calloway girl?" "I swung split," said another. He meant Nora Calloway, daughter of the man who ran the mill office on the river's south bank. I knew who she was the way you know anyone in a valley this size, by sight, by reputation, by the things people say when they think you're not listening. What I'd heard was that she was 26, unmarried, and that her hair was the color of a fox pelt in October, and that this had been, for reasons I never fully understood, the cause of considerable difficulty in her life. "What about her?" I said. "Wicker turned her down." I stopped, looked at him. "Silas Wicker." "Oh." Silas Wicker was, depending on who you talked to, either the most eligible man in Cutter's Ford or the most insufferable one. He had a good piece of bottom land, a new house, and the kind of blonde, unremarkable face that seemed to reassure people. He was 31 and looking for a wife, and the looking had been public enough that the whole valley had opinions about it. "What'd he say?" Harlan scratched the back of his neck, said the hair wasn't right, that a wife with hair like that would be, I don't recall the exact word, conspicuous. I picked up the axe again. "That's 9, Harlan said. 9 men turned her down, and every last one of them said something about that hair." I swung. The round split and the 2 halves fell away in opposite directions, and I stood there with the axe at my side, watching them lie there in the mud. "Why are you telling me this?" I said. Harlan smiled, which on his face was not a particularly readable expression. "No reason," he said. "Just thought you might want to know." He left the same way he came, slow, like he was leaving something behind on purpose. "I want to tell you about the winter Lena died, because you can't understand any of what came after without knowing what came before. She died in February, 3 years before any of this. Pneumonia took her in 11 days, which I did not think was possible until it happened, and then I thought, 11 days is a long time to watch someone go and not be able to do a thing about it. She was 38. I was 39. People said that was young, and they were right, though I'm not sure anyone's idea of young or old means much when you're sitting beside a bed at 2 in the morning counting the spaces between breaths. We'd been married 7 years. No children, which was a grief of its own kind, quiet and chronic, the kind you don't talk about because there's no moment it becomes news. You just carry it alongside the ordinary days, and after a while it becomes part of the weight of you. We had the cabin up on the logging cut, the trees, the work. We had enough. I thought we had enough. After she died, I kept working. That's what you do. The trees don't wait. The winter contracts don't care what happened in your house in February. I felled timber from sunup until my arms stopped working, and then I came home and sat by the stove in a cabin that still had her apron on the hook by the door. And I did not take the apron down for a full year, because I couldn't decide whether leaving it there was worse than what removing it would mean. There was a jar of dried sage on the shelf she'd hung for smell. I left that too. I left most of it. The cabin became a kind of museum of the life we'd had, and I lived in it the way you live in a museum, quietly, careful not to disturb anything. The town left me alone, mostly. I think they were a little afraid of me by then. I was not a man who invited conversation at the best of times, and grief had made me quieter still. I did my business at the feed store and the mill. I felled what I was contracted to fell, and I went home. I talked to my horses more than I talked to people. The horses didn't require anything from me except work and feed and the occasional word, and that suited me. I told myself I wasn't lonely. I told myself I was a man who had what he needed: land, work, enough money to eat through winter. A lot of men had less. That was my life. For 3 years, that was the whole of it. The apron was still on the hook. I saw her for the first time at the Callaway Mill office. I'd come to settle an account, timber I'd hauled down in October, payment that was owed and had been slow in coming the way payments from Amos Callaway always were. He was a decent man, but he didn't like parting with money, and you had to sit across from him and wait while he performed a kind of theatrical suffering over each dollar, squinting at the ledger like the numbers were personally disappointing him. She was at the desk when I came in, not Amos, her. She had a ledger open and a pen in her hand, and she didn't look up right away. I stood there in the door, and the light was coming through the single window behind her desk, and it caught her hair, which was, I don't have a better word for it, it was alive. Like something burning but controlled. Like the color had opinions about being there. I had heard about the hair, everyone in the valley had heard about the hair, and I had formed some picture of it in my mind over the years from people's descriptions, which had mostly been unflattering. The reality was nothing like what people said. It was the most striking thing I'd seen in a long time. "Mr. Riordan," she said without looking up. "Miss Callaway. Father's at the river. He'll be back within the hour. You can wait." She made a note in the ledger. "Or you can come back." "I'll wait." I sat in the chair along the wall, and she went on working, and neither of us said anything for a while. I looked at my hands, at the floor, at the wall. I looked at her twice, and both times she was writing something down or flipping back to check a figure, wholly occupied, unbothered by my presence in the room in a way that I found, for reasons I couldn't name immediately, restful. Most people in a room with me were bothered by something. They wanted to say the right thing about Lena, or they wanted to make sure they didn't say the wrong thing, and the effort of this made them stiff and strange. She was neither. She just worked. "You're the one who hauls out of the North Cut," she said, still writing. "I am. You felled the Norway pines last March. Father said you took the whole stand in 3 days. 4. She looked up then. She had green eyes, which I had not expected, and there was something in them that was not quite amusement but was in the neighborhood of it. He said 3. He wasn't there. She held my gaze for a moment, then she went back to the ledger. "No," she said, "he never is." That was all. Amos came back an hour later, and we settled the account, and I rode home. But I thought about those green eyes for longer than I had any particular reason to, and I thought about the ledger on the desk, and the way she'd held the pen and not looked up when I came in, and I thought, that is a woman who does her own accounting and doesn't look up from it for anyone. There was something in that I respected, the way you respect a well-built fence, simple, no show, exactly what it's supposed to be. I want to be honest with you about something. I was not a man who thought much about women by that point. I had loved one woman and she was gone, and the idea of beginning again with anyone seemed not impossible exactly, but very far away. Like a country I'd heard of once and didn't figure I'd ever see. I wasn't pining. I wasn't looking. I had closed that room, or thought I had. What I felt, sitting in that mill office, was not romantic. It wasn't even particularly warm. It was more like noticing something you hadn't expected to notice. The same feeling you get when you're working a stand and you push through the brush and suddenly there's a tree in front of you, a real one, old growth, 200 years of rings, and you stop and you look and you don't pick up the axe. Not because you can't, just because you want to look a minute. I rode home that afternoon thinking about the Norway pines, which were what I'd gone to the mill about. I was thinking about the next cut, the spring contracts. I was not thinking about Nora Callaway. Or that's what I told myself. Harlan wasn't the last person to mention her to me that fall. This was, I came to understand, not a coincidence. The valley had opinions. It had opinions about everything: whose fence was crooked, whose cattle were getting into whose hay, who was courting who and whether they should be. Nora Calloway and her 9 rejections were the current main subject, and somewhere in the valley's collective thinking, my name had gotten attached to hers. I'm not sure who started it. Probably Harlan, though I never proved it. I heard it first from the woman at the dry goods store, who mentioned it with such elaborate casualness that it took me a moment to understand what she was doing. I heard it a second time from Draper, my neighbor to the south, who brought it up while we were fixing the fence line between our properties and then pretended he hadn't. I heard it a third time from the preacher, which surprised me most of all, and in a place of worship no less. He had been going on about community and belonging, and then managed to work in something about how a valley needs all its people to find their place, and he looked at me when he said it, and I looked back at him, and he had the decency to clear his throat and move on. None of them said it directly. They were all dancing around the same thing, that a man on his own and a woman who'd been turned away 9 times might have something in common, and wouldn't it be something if they figured that out? I ignored it, or I tried to. The trouble was, I kept seeing her. Cutter's Ford was not a large place. She was at the general store on the same Tuesday I was. She was at the smithy when I came in with a busted draw hook, sitting on the bench outside with a book in her hands, reading like the world wasn't doing anything in particular around her. Once on the road back from the North Cut, I passed her wagon going the other direction, and we both slowed, and she raised a hand, and I raised mine, and neither of us said anything. But she held my eye for just a beat longer than a stranger would have. Or maybe I was the one who held it, I wasn't sure. Green eyes steady. I went home and thought about that for 3 days. What finally happened was not romantic. I want to be clear about that. What happened was that in late October, Amos Calloway's mill took on more contracts than he had men to run the books, and Nora was working until dark 3 nights a week. And one of those nights, I came to pick up a load receipt that had been left behind, and the horse she'd come in on had thrown a shoe. I know about horses. I know about most things that need doing outdoors and some things that need doing in. A thrown shoe in October, 10 miles from town at dusk, with the temperature dropping and the road soft from a week of rain, that is not a small problem. That is a cold night, and a lame horse and nobody coming. She was standing outside the mill when I rode up, looking at the horse's foreleg with the expression of someone who already knows the answer and doesn't particularly like it. "Shoes off," I said. "I can see that." She straightened up, brushing mud off her hands on her coat. I was going to walk her in. 10 miles. I've walked further. I did not doubt this. But I also had a horse that could carry 2, and I was not, whatever else I was, the kind of man who rides past a woman with that particular problem and keeps going. My father would have reached through the ground and taken me by the collar. "I'll take you to Draper's. He's got a boy who does farrier work, and I can get the shoe on before it's full dark." She looked at me. There was that steadiness in her eyes again, weighing something, not me specifically, I thought, but the situation, whether it was what it appeared to be. She'd had enough men offer things and want things back that she had every right to be careful. "All right," she said. I helped her up behind me. She took the hand up without making a production of it, and she put her hands on my sides, not clutching, just resting there light, like she was being careful not to presume anything. We rode the 2 miles to Draper's in the fading light with her horse walking behind on a lead, and she didn't make unnecessary conversation, which I respected. The air had that smell it gets in late October in the mountains, cold coming in over the pine, wood smoke from somewhere, the particular stillness that comes just before dark when everything seems to settle and hold its breath. Draper's boy got the shoe on. I paid him. She didn't argue about it, which surprised me a little. Most people argue about that kind of thing, especially people who are careful about owing. On the way back to town, after a while, she said, "Why did you stop?" "Beg your pardon." When you came up the road, you could have kept going, most men would have. I thought about that. My father didn't raise me to ride past a problem I could fix. She was quiet a moment. What happened to him? Kicked by a horse, actually, when I was 11, I paused. He'd have found that funny. She laughed. It was a short sound, a little surprised, and it did something to the air between us that I hadn't expected. Opened it up somehow. We rode on in the dark. I didn't ask to see her again. I'm not sure I knew yet that I wanted to. Or rather, I knew, but I hadn't decided what to do about it, which in my life is a different thing. But I thought about her. I thought about the ledger and the green eyes and the way she'd laughed, and I thought about what Harlan had said. 9 men, and every one of them had something to say about that hair. I thought about that quite a bit, actually. I couldn't make sense of it. I'd spent enough time in the mountains to know that red is not a color nature is stingy with. It's in the leaves every October. It's in the sunset. It's in the clay at the edge of the river when the water runs low in August. It's in the sky some mornings before a clear day. The idea that something that color was a defect struck me as the kind of thinking that comes from never having paid attention to anything, from living indoors too much, from deciding what you wanted before you looked at what was in front of you. But I was aware, turning this over, that I was also doing something else, that I was building a case, that I was thinking about Nora Calloway the way you think about a piece of ground you're considering, walking the edges of it, checking the soil, imagining what you'd put there. And I hadn't done that in 3 years. I hadn't done that since before Lena got sick. I was 42 years old. I had a cabin that was too quiet. I had an apron on a hook and a jar of dried sage on the shelf, and 3 years of a life that was sufficient in every way and warm in none. I didn't know what I was doing. She came to the North Cut in November. I saw her from up on the slope, her horse picking along the logging road below, her sitting straight in the saddle, the red of her hair bright in the gray November light even under her hat. I climbed down, brushed bark off my coat, came over. "Miss Calloway, Father sent me with a contract amendment." She pulled a folded paper from her coat and held it out. "He was going to come himself, but his leg is bad this week." I took the paper. "Read it." The wind was cold off the ridge, and I turned slightly so my body blocked it from the page. Read it again to be sure I was reading it right. "This changes the weight on the second delivery." "I know. It's not in my favor." "I know that too." She looked at me with those steady eyes. "I told him so. He didn't much care." I folded the paper and put it in my pocket. I looked out at the trees. The pines were moving in that wind, slow, like they were thinking about something. "I'll honor it," I said. "Tell him I said so." She didn't move to go. I looked back at her. "I wanted to thank you," she said, "for the other night with the horse." It was nothing. It wasn't nothing. There was a pause, not uncomfortable, just present, like a thing that had weight. You didn't have to stop, and you didn't make it strange afterward. I didn't know what to say to that. She seemed to understand this, seemed to take it in stride, the way she took most things. "Most men," she said, "when they do something decent, they want something for it, or they want to be thanked in a particular way. You just did it, and then you went on." I looked at her for a moment. "You've had trouble with that, men wanting things for what they do." She didn't answer directly. She looked away toward the tree line, and something in her face shifted, very slightly, and I understood that I was correct. More correct than I maybe wanted to be. "I should get back," she said. "I'll ride to the road with you." She let me, and at the road, before she turned south, she looked at me one more time, and I thought there was something she was deciding, whether to say something or not. The moment sat there between us like a stone in a stream. She decided not. She touched her heels to the horse and was gone around the bend, and I stood there in the logging road with the contract amendment in my pocket and the cold coming in, and something in my chest that I had not felt in 3 years. Not happiness, not yet, something quieter. More like a door opening in a room I thought had been closed for good, and the air that came through it was different from the air in the rest of the house. Harlan Metz came back in late November. I knew what he was going to say before he said it. Grantham put his name forward, he said, for Nora Calloway. I was at the workbench in the barn. I kept working. There was a harness piece that needed stitching, and I was not going to stop on Harlan's account. Grantham, I said. Thomas Grantham has the feedlot off Miller Road. He paused, picked up a leather scrap from the bench and looked at it for no reason. He's a reasonable man. I'm sure he is. Another pause. She turned him down. I looked up. First time she's been the one doing the turning down, Harlan said, with that unreadable smile. People are talking about why. I set down the needle. Harlan. Riordan. Say what you came to say. He looked at me for a long moment. He was maybe 60, Harlan, had buried a wife of his own 15 years back and never remarried, and I'd sometimes wondered if that was his preference or just the way things had gone. There was something in his face when he said the next thing that was less scheming and more plain, like a man who had seen some things and was trying to say something true. You've got about one winter to figure out if you're the kind of man who does something about a thing, he said, or the kind who watches it go past and regrets it later. He left, same as always. I stood in the barn for a long time after that, long enough for the light to change and the temperature to drop and my breath to start showing in the air. I could hear the horses moving in the stalls, an owl somewhere out in the timber starting its evening. Then I went inside, and I took Lena's apron down off the hook. I stood there with it in my hands for a minute. It was just cloth, a printed blue and white thing she'd bought at the dry goods store in the first year of our marriage, and it had gotten stained and faded, and the strings had been retied so many times they were shorter than they started. It smelled like the cedar chest, mostly. It had stopped smelling like her a long time ago. I folded it. I put it in the cedar chest at the foot of the bed, where I kept things I wanted to keep but not look at every day. Set it down on top of her winter shawl and the letters she'd written me the year before we married. I stood there with my hand on the lid of the chest. I didn't cry. I had done my crying, 3 years of it in the dark when no one was there to see. What I felt instead was something I didn't have a precise word for, a settling maybe. The way a house settles in winter, finding its rest against the cold. Something that had been held up finally laying itself down. I said something to her, out loud, which I hadn't done before, hadn't been able to. I told her I was all right. I told her she didn't need to worry. Then I closed the chest and went to make supper, and for the first time in 3 years the cabin didn't feel like a museum. It felt like a place where things might still happen. I went to see Amos Calloway in early December. I told him I was there about a secondary contract, some timber I had coming off the far ridge that I hadn't spoken for yet. This was true. We talked that business first, which felt right, because it kept things in the order they belonged. And when we were done, when the papers were set aside and he was refilling his coffee, I said, "I'd like to call on your daughter." He set the coffee pot down. He looked at me. He had a broad, cautious face. Amos did. The face of a man who had spent 30 years making deals and knew what things were being asked for even before they were fully asked. "Nora's her own woman," he said finally. "You'll need to ask her." "I know that. I'm asking you first because it seems right." He thought about this a moment longer, turned his coffee cup around in his hands. He stopped, started again. "She's had some difficulty, with men who thought they knew what she should be." "I know. What do you know about it?" I looked at him straight. "I know she's been turned down 9 times because of her hair," I said. "And I know she turned Thomas Grantham down recently, which took its own kind of nerve. And I know she keeps your books straighter than you keep them yourself." Something moved behind his eyes. It might have been a little sheepishness. "That's true enough," he said. I'm not a young man, I said. I'm not easy to know. I was married for 7 years and my wife died and I've been on my own for 3. I'm not bringing much from the outside that would look like a prize. I looked at him. But I don't have a single thought about her hair except that it's the best-looking thing in this valley. And I'm a man who keeps his word and does his work and doesn't drink. That's what I have. He was quiet for a time that started to feel long. She'll be at the house Sunday, he said. Afternoon. I spent the better part of Saturday in a state that I can only describe as ridiculous. I fixed things that didn't need fixing. I went over the barn twice, checked the hinge on a gate that was fine, restacked wood that was already stacked. I cleaned my boots, then cleaned them again because I'd gotten sawdust on them walking back from the barn. I sat down 3 times to eat supper and got up without eating each time, which was not something I had ever done before in my life, not even in the weeks after Lena died, because a man who works outdoors does not miss meals. His body won't permit it. I went to bed late and lay there looking at the ceiling. What was I doing? I was a widower who smelled like pine sap and had hands the size of dinner plates and hadn't said more than 30 words together to a woman in 3 years. I was a man who people described, when they were being charitable, as quiet. When they were being accurate, they said other things: reserved, difficult to reach, closed off. None of that was wrong. And a woman who'd spent her life being told she was somehow wrong herself had every right to want something a little warmer than what I could probably offer. And yet, I got up in the dark and went and sat by the stove and drank coffee until the sun came up. Watched the light change outside the south window, the mountains going from black to gray to pale blue to white. The cold was coming down off the ridge and the cabin was warm and the fire was steady, and I thought, you have held worse things together than this. You have worked through cold that froze your breath on the axe handle and you have kept going. You will go there Sunday and you will say what is true, and whatever comes of it will come. The Calloway house was a good-sized place for the valley, 2 stories, white paint that needed another season before it needed redoing, a porch that ran the full front with a railing that Amos had built straight. I came up the road in the Sunday quiet, my horse's feet loud on the frozen ground, and she was already on the porch. She'd seen me coming. She was sitting in a wooden chair with her hands in her lap, and she watched me ride up the way she watched most things, even measuring, without any of the performance that other people put into being watched. No fussing with her hair or her dress. Just sitting there, watching, ready to take whatever came honestly. I tied the horse and came up the steps and stood there with my hat in my hands. "Mr. Riordan," she said. "Miss Calloway." I looked at her. At the red hair which was down today, not up long down her back, just the front of it tucked back with 2 pins. The sun was at an angle and it hit the color, and I thought again, how does a person look at that and find a complaint? "You look fine," I said. She seemed surprised. Not by the compliment exactly, but by the plainness of it, like she'd been bracing for something more complicated, and I'd come in clean instead. "Thank you," she said. "Your father let me come. I told him I wanted to call on you, but I wanted to ask you myself." "I heard," she said. "Word travels." "In this valley it does." She looked at me steadily. "Why? Why do I want to call on you?" "Yes." I thought about this, not because I didn't know, but because I wanted to say it right the first time. I'd spent enough years working with wood to know that rushing a cut you can't undo is a fool's move. "Because you're the most sensible woman I've encountered in a long time," I said. "Because you kept your own books when your father wouldn't. Because you didn't make it strange when I helped you with the horse. Because you turned Grantham down, and I think I know why, and I think you were right too." She looked at me. "And because," I said, "every man in this valley has had something to say about your hair, and I don't understand it. It's the finest thing for 50 miles, and anyone who said different was a fool who wasn't paying attention." Something crossed her face. Not quite tears. Something quieter, deeper, the kind of thing that happens when you've been told the same wrong thing so many times that hearing the right thing catches you off guard. The way a sudden warm day in February catches you before you're ready for it. Like you'd forgotten warmth was possible, and there it is anyway. "You'd better sit down," she said. I sat in the other chair and we talked for 2 hours. She asked me about Lena and I told her straight what we had, what the 7 years were like, what those 11 days in February were. She didn't offer condolences the way people do, that particular polite misery that's more about the speaker than the one who lost. She just listened and asked a question here and there, and when I was done she said, "She sounds like she was good." "She was," I said, "she was good." "And you're not trying to replace her?" "No," I said, "you can't replace a person. You just keep going. Try to take what was good and carry it forward without wearing it like a wound." Nora nodded, slowly, like something had been confirmed that she'd been sitting with for a while. "I've been proposed to 9 times, she said. "I know. And every one of them wanted me to be something other than what I am, something quieter, something," she paused, looked out at the yard where a pair of sparrows were doing something territorial in the bare lilac bush. "Less. They wanted less of me." "I know that too." She looked back at me. "You don't know me yet." "No," I said, "that's why I came to call." She was quiet for a moment, and then something in her face eased slightly. Not a smile exactly, a loosening. "Silas Wicker," she said, "told me that a woman with hair like mine would embarrass him in church." I looked at her. "He said it in front of his mother," she added. "Who agreed?" I thought about Silas Wicker, and about his mother, and about what I thought of people who said things like that to another person in front of witnesses and expected the world to go along with them. "Silas Wicker," I said, "has all the bottomland he deserves." She laughed, and this time it wasn't short, it came up from somewhere and lasted a little, and she put her hand over her mouth the way people do when they laugh harder than they meant to, and I sat there watching it and thought, there it is. That's what was behind all that steadiness. Not coldness, not armor, just a woman who had learned to keep the good parts safe. We saw each other through December. A meal at the house on Sundays, which Amos presided over with the dignity of a man who decided to be pleased with himself about something, and wasn't going to undercut his own satisfaction by being subtle about it. He asked me questions about the timber trade that he already knew the answers to, which I understood was his way of filling the air while he watched us together, checking his arithmetic. A walk once when the weather broke for a day and the creek was running clear, and you could see the gravel on the bottom, and the air smelled clean the way it does after a hard freeze breaks. We walked for 2 hours. I don't think we spoke for the first 20 minutes of it, both of us just moving through the cold air, watching the water, and it was not awkward. It was the kind of silence you can only have with someone whose company you've already settled into, which struck me as remarkable for 2 people who'd known each other less than 2 months. She told me on that walk about the last of the 9. Not Wicker, one before him, a man named Collier who'd come out from a town to the east, a banker's son with money and a good coat. She said he'd sat across from her at her father's table and looked at her hair for the whole first half of the meal without saying anything, and then, during the soup, had mentioned that his mother had suggested he might overlook it if everything else was right, as if this were a kindness he was offering. She'd thanked him for coming and shown him to the door. I listened to this. I thought about a younger version of her, 20 or 22, at the beginning of all that. What it does to a person to be told, again and again, that the thing that is most visibly them is the thing that's wrong, whether you learn to be angry about it or just quiet. "You're not angry about it," I said. "I thought you might be." She considered this. "I was," she said, "for a while. Then I got tired of being angry and just got clear, like I knew exactly what I was looking for and I wasn't going to settle below it." "What were you looking for?" She looked at the creek, someone who looked at me and saw me, not a problem to be managed. I didn't say anything. I figured the silence said enough. She came to the mill twice when I was picking up loads, and I showed her the contract amendment her father had sent, and she looked at it and made a sound that I won't repeat here because her father is a decent man, but she understood exactly what I had understood about it, which was that it was not particularly fair to me. She went home, and the following week a new amendment arrived that was considerably more reasonable, and Amos never said a word about it, and neither did I. What I noticed about being around her was that I talked more than I usually did. This surprised me. I'd thought of myself as a man who had largely exhausted his interest in conversation, who had said most of what he had to say and was content to let the silence do the work. With her, it was different. She asked things that required actual thought, not polite things, not weather and fences things, but real questions about how I worked, how I'd learned what I knew, what I thought about this or that thing that had happened in the valley. And she listened to the answers. Really listened in the way that's rare enough that you notice it when it happens. I started to look forward to Sundays in a way I hadn't looked forward to anything in a long time. I noticed this. I thought it was probably a good sign. I didn't examine it too closely. In January, she asked me about the North Cut, about what it was like up there in real winter. I described it once casually, and she'd asked 3 questions that told me she'd been thinking about it since. I said, "Come and see." She came up on a Saturday in mid-January, on a day when the sky was the color of pewter and the snow was 2 feet deep off the road, and the pines looked like something from another country, white and still and cathedral quiet. I rode ahead and broke trail and she followed, and when we came out into the cut, she pulled up and sat there and I watched her look at it. The whole valley spread below. The river was a black line in the white. The sky had that particular weight it gets before a storm, heavy and close, pressing down on everything in a way that should feel oppressive but instead feels intimate, like the world drawing in. The trees around us were enormous old-growth Douglas fir, some of them 8 feet across, the bark thick as armor, the crowns lost in the gray sky. "This is where you work," she said, not a question. "This is where I work." She was quiet for a long time. The horses stood still in the snow, patient, steaming. A chickadee called from somewhere in the timber, that small, clean sound, the same 3 notes it always makes, like it's telling you something simple and important. "I understand you better now," she said. I looked at her. She had her face turned up to the trees, and the gray light was on her hair, and she looked, I don't know how to say this without it sounding like more than it was. She looked like she belonged to this kind of country. Like she was at home in big, serious landscape, the way people who grew up in flat, easy places never quite are. "Do you?" I said. "You're not a man who explains himself," she said. "You just show people, you ride ahead and break trail." I didn't have an answer for that. She seemed to understand this. We rode back in the afternoon, ahead of the storm, and at the bottom of the logging road she said, "I think we should be married in the spring." I looked at her. "If you're going to ask me," she said, "I'm giving you my answer now so you don't have to worry about it." "I haven't asked yet." "I know." She looked at me with those eyes, steady and warm and completely in earnest. "I'm telling you the answer anyway." I sat on my horse in the snow at the bottom of the logging road and looked at this woman who had just told me plainly, without any coquettishness or performance, that she had made up her mind, and I thought, I have been alone for 3 years. I have worked in the cold and come home to the quiet and told myself it was enough. And here is a woman who looked at all of that and decided yes. "Spring then," I said. She touched her heels to the horse and rode, and I watched her go for a moment before I followed. There are things I want to tell you about the months between that January and the following April. I want to tell you about the February evening when she came to the cabin for the first time and stood in the doorway and looked around, and I watched her see everything. The plain furniture, the bare walls, the cedar chest at the foot of the bed, the hook by the door where the apron no longer hung. She took it all in quietly, didn't comment on the spareness of it, didn't suggest improvements. Just looked, the way she looked at everything, like she was learning the shape of a place before she said anything about it. She sat at the table and I made coffee and she took the cup and held it in both hands and we sat in that cabin in the winter quiet, and it was the least uncomfortable I had felt in a room with another person in 3 years. Maybe longer. I want to tell you about the argument we had in March, a real one, about the mill contract and about what was mine and what was right and what her father owed me. She took Amos's side at first, not because she thought he was right, I learned later, but because she wanted to hear my full case before she decided. And when I'd made it fully, without softening anything, she was quiet for a moment and then she said I was right, and that Amos was being pig-headed, and that she would handle it. I said I didn't want her handling my business with her father. She said she wasn't doing it for me. She was doing it because the numbers were the numbers and her father should know better. We were both hot about it for a day. The following morning I came to the house and she opened the door and looked at me and I looked at her and she said, "I'm still right." And I said, "I know." And she stepped aside to let me in. And I understood then that this was a woman who would fight me when I was wrong and stand with me when I was right and not mix up the two, which is rarer than it ought to be. The week before we married, in early April, she came up to the North Cut. I was limbing a felled fir, working my way down from the crown, the axe moving steady, the smell of fresh-cut wood coming up sharp and clean in the spring air. I saw her horse at the edge of the cut, and I climbed down and walked over, pulling my gloves off. "What are you doing up here?" I said. "I wanted to see where you'd be." She looked at me. The spring was doing something with the air up here. The snow was off most of the slopes and the ground was wet and dark, and there were small green things coming up at the edges of the cut where the light came in. She had her hair loose, which I hadn't seen before. All of it down, moving in the wind off the ridge. "Come here," I said. She came down off the horse and I took her hair in my hands, both of them, careful, the way you'd handle something you knew was worth handling well. She was still, watching my face. I gathered it back and began to braid it, slow and deliberate. My hands were big and rough and not made for delicate things, but I'd spent 30 years working with my hands and I knew how to be precise when precision mattered. I'd learned this from watching my mother, years and years ago, sitting behind her at the kitchen table on winter mornings while she braided my sister's hair before school. I'd thought, at the time, it was useless knowledge for a boy to have. I had been wrong about that, as it turned out. She didn't say a word while I did it. The wind moved through the tops of the firs above us, and the horses stood quiet, and the only sound was the spring, the birds, the faint creak of the trees. When I was done, I held the end of the braid, not sure what to do with it without a tie, and she reached up and took it from me and held it herself and looked at me with those eyes, and there was something in them I recognized, finally, for what it was. Not gratitude, not warmth exactly. Something harder and better than both. The kind of recognition you wait your whole life to see in someone's eyes, the look that says, "I see you, I see what you are, and I am not going anywhere." "9 men, I said. "9 men, she agreed. "Their loss," I said. She smiled, slow starting at her eyes. "Yes," she said, "it was." I put my hands on either side of her face, careful, those rough hands on that face, and I kissed her. They're in the spring cut with the sap running in the firs and the mountains all around us. And she put her hand flat on my chest, not pulling me in, not pushing me away, just resting it there over my heart, feeling what was in it. We were married on the 15th of April. The preacher came up to the valley's little church and there were about 40 people, which was more than I'd expected. Harlan Metz was in the 3rd row looking like a man who had placed a wager and won it and was enjoying the victory quietly. The preacher said the words. I said mine. She said hers. Nora wore a dress the color of cream and her hair was braided back on one side with a few strands loose at the temples, and she walked to the front of that church and looked at me the same way she'd looked at me in the North Cut level, certain, choosing. Like she'd weighed the whole thing and was satisfied with what she'd decided. No second thoughts in those green eyes. No hesitation. I had not thought, at 42, that I would stand in front of a preacher again and mean what I was saying. I meant every word. Afterward at the house, Harlan got me in a corner with a glass of whiskey and said, "Well," in the tone of a man who is extremely pleased with himself and thinks he's earned the right to be. And I said, "Don't." And he smiled that smile of his and went to bother someone else, and I watched him go and thought, all right, fair enough. I want to end here with this. The cabin is different now. Not changed exactly, the same four walls, the same stove, the same mountains out the south window, but it sounds different, it smells different. There's a lantern burning on the table most evenings where there used to be dark, and there are voices, one of them hers, the other mine, and sometimes the silence between them has a quality it never had before. Like the silence in a room where something good is resting, not the silence of a room waiting to be abandoned. She moved her books in, the real ones, the mill ledger she maintains, because Amos, for all his stubbornness, is not a fool, and he knows what she's worth to the operation. They're on the shelf next to the mantel where I used to have nothing but a candle and a spare pair of gloves. Her coat is on the peg by the door. Some mornings I come in from the early chores and she's at the table with her coffee and the ledger open, her hair braided or pinned or just loose down her back, and she doesn't look up right away, and I stand in the doorway for a moment and look at her and feel, I don't know the name for it exactly, something that had been turned down to a coal for 3 years coming back to a fire. Something I had told myself I didn't need anymore, because telling yourself that is easier than admitting you miss it. 9 men. 9 men who looked at that hair and saw a problem. 9 men who looked at that woman, her steadiness, her mind, her honesty, that laugh she keeps tucked behind the serious face, and found something to turn away from. I have tried more than once to understand it, and I can't. I spent 30 years in the timber. I know solid wood when I stand next to it. I know what it is to find a tree that is exactly what it appears to be, no soft core, no hidden rot, the real thing all the way through. You don't cut that down. You don't walk past it. She is the real thing. Some mornings she leans against the doorframe while I load the wagon, watching me work, with a cup of coffee in both hands and her coat half buttoned and the morning light on that red hair, and she'll say something dry about the load I'm taking or the weather that's coming in, and I'll say something back, and then I'll go, and all day up in the trees I'll carry it with me. That moment, that ordinary thing. There's a kind of man who goes through his life being overlooked. Not because he's nothing, because he's the kind of nothing that doesn't make noise, doesn't push himself forward, doesn't dress a thing up to be more than it is. He does the work. He keeps his word. He takes what comes and doesn't complain about it. And the world, being what it is, passes right over him half the time looking for something louder. I was that man for a long time. I was that man for longer than I knew. And then a woman with red hair and green eyes sat across a desk from me and didn't look up, and later stood in a logging road at dusk, looking at a lame horse with the expression of someone who had already figured out the problem, and later still climbed up behind me on my horse and rested her hands against my sides like she was being careful not to presume anything. And one afternoon she came up into the mountains and let me braid her hair, and looked at me after with those eyes, and I understood. This is what it is to be seen. Not the version of you that you perform for people. Not the cleaned-up version or the apologetic version or the version that shrinks itself down to fit someone else's idea of what you should be. The real version. The one that works in the cold and doesn't say much and keeps what he loves close and quiet. She saw that. She chose it. Freely with her eyes open, knowing full well what she was getting. And what she was getting was a man who is not easy to know, who goes quiet when he's thinking something hard, who will sometimes be up before dawn staring at the stove, who carries things he doesn't always say out loud. A man who smells like sawdust and axle grease most days, who has rough hands and not much furniture, who spent 3 years living in a museum of his own grief. She knew all of this. She sat in that Sunday chair and asked me about Lena and listened to the whole of it, not flinching, not rushing me past it, and then she said, "She sounds like she was good." That was a thing a person of exceptional character says. You recognize it when you hear it. The willingness to honor what someone else was without making it into a rival or a shadow or a cautionary tale. She gave Lena her dignity, and in doing that she gave me mine too, the right to have loved well and lost and still be a man with something left to offer. I come home in the evenings and the light is on. I come through the door and she looks up from whatever she's doing, and she doesn't say anything half the time, just looks at me the way she looked at me in that church, like a woman who made a decision and has no regrets about it. Sometimes she'll ask about the cut or the weather on the ridge. Sometimes she just goes back to her ledger, and I go and wash up and we get supper together, and it is so quiet and so ordinary and so entirely what I did not know I was missing that I sometimes stand at the basin for a moment longer than I need to, just to feel the weight of it. I'm 63 now. That's how long it's taken me to get to this. Some years of youth, some years of a first good love, some years of cold, dark surviving, and then this woman at the table with her red hair and her ledger and her coffee and her particular brand of steady. I don't know what I did to deserve the second chance. I'm not sure deserving is how it works. What I know is that I stopped. When I could have kept writing, I stopped. And she was already at the desk when I walked in, not looking up. That's the whole of it. That's more than enough.